Now, I would like to give the floor to Agneta Soderberg, who's the head of the Fojo Media Institute. So, Agneta, please go ahead.
Thank you, Aime. Maybe I need to start with saying that I'm actually not the head of Fojo Media Institute. I'm a gender advisor and senior advisor and gender expert, just to get things correct.
Apologies.
So, no problem. I think we have the director with us in the audience, Kersti Forsberg. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who have joined us here today from around the globe. I saw on the map that there's a big spread, and that's really nice to have you all here. We are now moving from safety specifically to looking more broadly at gender equality in media law and policy frameworks. For us, this is a happy moment to present for the first time the findings of the study on gender equality and media regulation that we have been working on for almost a year. This is a unique study in the sense that it examines how and to what extent gender equality and freedom of expression is integrated into media law and policy, not either or. This is a mix of both media law and policy. The study was initiated by Fojo Media Institute and has been conducted in collaboration with the Department of Journalism, Media and Communication at Gothenburg University, with international media support as contributing partner. So why is this study important? There are several reasons. To fill blank spots, there is limited comparative data on gender equality in media law and policy, especially in the global south. Secondly, to investigate the potential tension between promoting and protecting when it comes to women's freedom of expression and gender equality vis-a-vis media freedom. We also wanted to identify policy measures and mechanisms that can promote gender equality in and through media without comprising media freedom and independence. Generally, self-regulation of news media is seen as the ideal mechanism to safeguard media freedom. At the same time, calls are being made to governments and states to promote gender equality in and through the media, most famously Section J in the Beijing Platform for Action. And in some cases, government policies can be a way forward, for example, when it comes to gender equality connected to broadcasting, licensing, etc. But it has to be kept in mind that both policies and legislation can be misused to infringe on media freedom. Looking from a broader human rights perspective, gender equality and freedom of expression are not mutually exclusive, but rather reinforce each other. What we will be sharing with you today is the first round of findings from the Global Gender and Media Regulation Project. We are soon to finalize a number of national reports that are part of the first phase of the project. This will be followed up by studies in other countries where Fojo is active. We will keep you all posted on the developments. The project also has its dedicated website that opened today, and we will also share a link in the end. With us here today to present the findings of the study, we have a number of insightful people. First on stage are the two experts in the global research team, Sarah Macharia and Joan Barata Mir, followed by Karatul Aitamin Miti from MRDI, Media Resource and Development Institute in Bangladesh. She's the lead researcher in Bangladesh. Then next would be Virginia Mubanegwa, who's a gender equality expert and the lead researcher in Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, when I last checked, Virginia is not with us yet. I know she arrived in New York this morning, so I hope she will come and join us before it's her turn. But we also have a video to show from Zimbabwe. And last but not least, Maria Edström from the Department of Journalism, Media and Communication at University of Gothenburg. But we will start, but before we start with the presentations, we're going to visit Zimbabwe, one of the countries that are part of this project. So please turn on the video.
Thank you, Agneta. We will load the video momentarily. Please bear with us.
And Virginia is actually featuring in the video. So if she will not make it, you will meet her in this video.
Zimbabwe is a very good legislative framework as far as gender equality and women empowerment is concerned. And this was also confirmed in the research as we studied the context, the framework, the policies that are there. Capacity needs to be built within the media houses to go beyond adoption of policies, because we found in the research that a lot of the media houses had adopted some framework or other to deal with gender. But what we need to be able to do is to now get them to move from policy adoption to implementation, and then to evaluating the efficacy of their implementation of the gender policies.
Previous reports had indicated that in terms of even the coverage of women, there was a challenge. There was no gender parity in terms of the sources, in terms of coverage on gender issues. But what the new Code of Ethics did was to put in place guidelines in terms of how the media can cover issues of gender representation, voices, and even the gender-sensitive language that the media was not doing quite well. And one of the opportunities that we have is to have the media organizations have a multi-stakeholder and partnerships in terms of ensuring that this happens. In terms of gender parity, you engage even the male reporters in the newsrooms to cover gender issues. It should not only be limited to the female journalists.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a video that showcased the Zimbabwe project. So now I would like to hand over to Sarah Macharia, who is actually the lead researcher of this project, to present part of the findings.
Thank you, Agneta. And before I even go there, so I'm going to share my screen. So in a nutshell, this study brings together in a central space. I think we'll stop sharing that one. Can we stop the quiz? Okay. There. So in a nutshell, this study brings together in a central space information about national media regulatory authorities and self-regulation bodies across the world. It identifies who these are as at November 2021 when we did our mapping. We also collate in a central space an indicative sample of regulatory instruments, including policies and codes around the world, as much as we could retrieve online, and as much as we could access in languages that we could decode, especially English, French, and Spanish. Finally, we also present a gender analysis of the frameworks, and we apply the insights to propose a pathway that has potential to drive gender equality in media through the regulation strategy. So our methods, we conducted a very extensive search last year in online databases, in media regulators' websites, and in media policy web portals. We drew the boundaries for the mapping and analysis around traditional or legacy news media forms of print, television, and radio, and other genres such as film and advertising were excluded. We also looked for information in policy documents, complemented by analysis of various studies that are published in scholarly journals and other academic publications. One thing, and we think this is an important finding, is that the process to retrieve the policies and codes of national media houses was complicated by the inability to find the texts on the websites of most of the respective organizations, which says something about the question of transparency. So we looked at policy at various levels, at the supranational level, at the national level, at the media self-regulation level, and in media organizations. So at the supranational level, these are the international and regional gender and media regulatory frameworks. We were able to classify what we found into 3 types of frameworks. Type A represent the greatest promise for progress towards gender responsive media structures, gender responsive practice, processes, and output and content. And why we say this is because they are the most comprehensive relative to types B and C on this table. In large part, their development and adoption owes to the feminist organizing or advocacy by gender and media movements. And under this type, we have the Beijing Platform for Action, Section J, other examples, and we have the full texts in the report. Other examples are the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of women in Africa, that was adopted in 2003. And then of course, the Council of Europe's 2013 recommendation of the Committee of Ministers to Member States on Gender Equality and Media. That was type A. Moving on to type B, these are frameworks that do not mention media explicitly, but they draw attention to issues that are in the media's sphere of influence, particularly norms and stereotypes about femininity and masculinity, gender relations in society. An example, the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that was adopted in 1979. And most recently, Agenda 2030, Transforming Our World. There are other examples in the report. And then type C are those, these are actually much less prevalent. And the central focus is actually media freedom and independence, with some mentions on the media's role in democracies. For example, the Declaration of Windhoek, which is on free, independent, pluralistic media worldwide. So what we conclude from this is that what the policies signify is that gender equality, freedom of expression, and media freedom and independence are not mutually exclusive. All are necessary for democracy and protected in international standards. And media freedom is not absolute. It is limited by the need to attend to other competing rights and freedoms. So in the report, we have various visual interactive elements. Here we see at the national level, what we found is that media in general and news media in particular are subject to national legislation regarding various levels of performance, which may not come as a surprise to many of us. Many countries protect media freedom within their constitutional law. The mandate of national regulators is diverse, and the most common responsibility being to grant licenses to broadcasters and to monitor legal compliance of license holders. So some of the interactive maps that you'll be able to access in the online version. Here is an example that shows the national authorities that are primarily responsible for audiovisual and telecommunication regulation. In our mapping, we covered almost 200 countries where we were able to retrieve this information. Okay, so next, is the instruments governing media from the national media regulatory bodies. We found that 1/3 of these instruments carry no provisions on gender equality or freedom of expression. Almost 1/2 of the instruments with gender equality measures protect the singular right to non-discrimination on the basis of a list of identities, including sex or gender. And what we thought is that the lack of further elaboration of gender-related issues may betray a hesitation to delineate tighter boundaries and to leave the task of working out the details to the other regulatory levels in industry and within media organizations. And the hesitation may also be due to care not to appear as encroaching on media independence. If we draw from examples in media-related clauses in gender policy instruments that are usually prefaced by a reminder of the pre-existing obligation to uphold the right to freedom of expression. So, but there are a few exceptions. For example, I think I will mention just one, the Morocco High Authority for Audiovisual Communication, HACA, that guided by a number of principles, including commitment to freedom of expression and to fighting sexist images in news and advertising. HACA, this Moroccan authority, regularly monitors gender stereotypes in content and imposes penalties in cases of non-compliance. So we'll move on to the next one. A third tier of bodies are the self-regulatory mechanisms. These are industry organizations whose role includes monitoring content, responding to public complaints, and limiting state interference. We found at least one self-regulatory body in most of the countries worldwide. And some countries have a form of co-regulation, which is a mix of industry, government, the public, and civil society organizations, all playing a role, for example, within the EU and in Canada. And here's another interactive map. Media self-regulation tools, they take various forms: ethic codes, charters, codes of conduct. But common to most of the codes is that prescription on gender non-discrimination or avoiding sexism. The codes treat gender as one among several other possible forms of discrimination. And what was not clear to us is, where codes incorporate a long checklist of diversity factors, gender issues appear to fade into the background. And while we know that media are duty-bound to reflect the diversity present in society, to what extent does intersectionality in codes, is it actually effective in keeping all issues salient in the high-pressure media production environment? And I'm almost coming to the end. This chart graphs the relationship between gender equality in the media and gender equality in society. We see a positive but moderate relationship between the two, but the news media lag behind. When we looked at our case studies like Zimbabwe and Bangladesh, there exist numerous guidelines and editorial policies with gender equality provisions in most media organizations, but their scores on the GEM index, which Maria is going to explain later, this is a measure that indicates the level of gender equality in the news media. The scores for Zimbabwe and Bangladesh are pretty poor. In Sweden, in contrast, there are few gender equality provisions in editorial policies and guidelines, but Sweden's performance on the gender gap score is pretty good. This suggests that factors beyond the presence of written down rules influence gender-aware practice and performance, and more likely gender equality in the broader landscape or environment. And then other things that are in the report, other elements in the report, we have compiled a number of good practices at different levels, at the level of statutory authorities, media regulation bodies, industry self-regulation, and media organizations. There are examples in the report, and I would encourage that we go there. But clarity on what a good practice is, I think, has to come from its outcomes and impact over the medium and long term. I think quite importantly, what we have done in the report is we have used these insights to propose a pathway to bolster regulatory frameworks for gender equality. We have the various regulatory levels and policy measures or regulatory measures that could be applied. I would just highlight two elements, and one is that it is necessary for legislation and regulation to be based on international standards and to link gender justice to specific policies. And secondly, it is necessary for media and communication legislation to introduce gender-specific provisions, which is one gap that we found. And with this, I will hand over to my colleague, John, who looked at the issue of media law. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. My presentation will basically, or will be necessarily complementary to what has already been presented, and will particularly focus on legal aspects, as basically the work has been based on international standards, applicable international human rights standards, as well as national legislation and best practices also when it comes to regulation. In any case, I think that this is the right time, as my colleague did at the beginning of her presentation, to now introduce question number 2 of the poll. I ask our technical, here we go.
We are currently looking at the results.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. So
At this time, if any of my co-hosts have the poll window open on your screen, I invite you to close it, please. Go ahead, Joan.
Thank you very much. So first of all, good evening from the Maldives, where I happen to be on a business trip. And my connection is a little bit unstable, so I apologize in advance if there's any little glitch. So I'll be, as I said, brief, and I'll basically, insist on some of the things that have already presented by my colleague Sarah. I focused on the legal aspects of the, let's say, the equation between gender and media regulation. I think it is very important from the very outset to remind the fact that freedom of expression and gender equality are international human rights that are equally protected by international legal instruments. States have the obligation not only not to restrict them, but also to create the enabling conditions for the exercise of such rights. Another important idea is that freedom of expression and gender equality are not mutually exclusive. These are rights that need to be interpreted and applied in a consistent manner, but we cannot say that more freedom of expression means gender equality and the opposite, and the other way around. So, I mean, two main ideas to start. Freedom of expression needs to be protected to be protected on a non-discriminatory basis. And also legal and policy measures aiming at protecting and promoting gender equality shall not establish unnecessary or disproportionate conditions, limitations, or restrictions to the right to freedom of expression. This is, the first conclusions from the international human rights framework. The second thing is, of course, right to freedom of expression from, let's say, the point of view of women. Women have the right to freedom of expression because, according to Article 19, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. And we need to insist on the fact that the right to freedom of expression entails the freedom to disseminate opinions and ideas and thoughts of all kinds, including the ideas, thoughts that offend, shock, or disturb the state or any sector of the population. So we will need to, keep this in mind, because of course, certain forms of sexist speech may be, under certain circumstances, protected under the freedom of expression clause. And this also only shows that, of course, legal instruments are limited and they need to be accompanied sometimes in order to address certain issues by policy measures and other types, educational measures, other types of measures. Truth is that in any case, when it comes to the right to freedom of expression of women, states have incorporated into their constitutional legal systems provisions both aiming at protecting freedom of expression and gender equality. It's much more difficult to find protections that are at the intersection of both rights, and it was even challenging to find a certain number of decisions, for example, by the European Court on Human Rights dealing with these matters. But there's, for example, a decision that is mentioned in the study on a case in Portugal where the court considered that the state of Portugal violated the right of freedom of expression of basically women's organizations because they tried to organize a series of debates on abortion in a country where at that time abortion was prohibited. And the court said that the right to freedom of expression of everyone, including women, also encompasses the right to discuss about these kind of matters that are relevant in terms of, I would say, the interests of a certain part of the society. So, and it's also obvious that restrictions to the right to freedom of expression to women do not only come from legal instruments or from judicial or administrative decisions. There's something that we can call gender censorship or gender self-censorship that may derive from interpretation of culture, religion, and tradition that subordinate women. So we also need to understand that, these kind of analysis needs to go beyond the law when we talk about censorship or self-censorship regarding the exercise of the right to freedom of expression. Safety of female journalists is something that has already been discussed and commented during this session. And I would only repeat many of the things that have already been said. So I'll move to the next slide. The next topic that is covered by the study is the right to access to information. You know that access to information is essential for people to know their rights, how they can be exercised, how they are protected vis-a-vis different sectors of society, particularly when it comes to sectors of society that are particularly marginalized or excluded and do not have systematic and dependable ways of acquiring information on the scope of their rights and how to exercise them. Particularly when it comes to women, ATI, access to information, is key to empower to agency because it can facilitate access to information, to public information of particular interest for women. And secondly, it is also an important instrument to grant access to gender-related information, including reproductive and sexual health and sexual education. So here, we all are very familiar with the right to access to information, the right to that every citizen has vis-a-vis the state authorities to obtain public information, but when it comes to the empowerment of women, a particular angle needs to be taken, particular consideration needs to be taken, and I would say also that access to information laws that exist in many countries represented here need to incorporate particularly some provisions that particularly focus on access to information by women. We talk about women's right to freedom of expression, but there's another perspective of this, that this is the presence and role of women in the media, as staff, collaborators, managers, owners. In general, it is very hard to find legal provisions, regulations with regards to these, at least when it comes to compulsory provisions. In some countries, when it comes to regulatory bodies, there are provisions saying that, women need to be represented as members of the respective boards. But in general, media legal framework generally focus on gender equality in media content, but not in media as companies, as organizations. Progress in this area particularly relies on the adoption of voluntary codes of conduct, self-regulation by media outlets. There's also the issue of the role of online platforms. First thing that it's a very complex issue, but I'll present here only 3 ideas. First idea is that what is illegal offline, it is also illegal online. And this also applies, of course, to all the provisions that are related to protection of gender equality. In addition to the law, second idea, platforms moderate content according to their own private rules. And here, for example, if we look into the community standards of most online platforms, social media platforms, we find provisions, let's say, prohibiting certain forms of harassment, attacks, the use of derogatory language, gender-based derogatory language, so on and so forth. But the truth is also that several content moderation rules and policies established by online platforms may also be used and have been used to curtail women's freedom of expression. The examples of, let's say, Instagram and Twitter nipples, and in cases of, let's say, campaigns against breast cancer, are quite known. Some issues of nudity, when nudity has, let's say, is basically a form of political speech, so to speak. And I also, I need to point out that in a decision, the Facebook Oversight Board has already had the occasion, the opportunity to stress this problem in a relatively recent decision on a picture that was taken down by Instagram that showed the nipple of a woman as part of an awareness campaign regarding breast cancer.
Juan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have to wrap up because otherwise we will not have time for discussion.
There are two things here, that are covered in hate speech and disinformation. I think that these are, very, very complex issues. When it comes to hate speech, we need to understand that it is banned by international law, but only when it constitutes a real incitement to violence. We also need to understand that hate speech applies only to protect minorities. So there's a question whether, let's say, women as 50% of a certain society can be seen as a minority. So here we can find a very interesting discussion when it comes to how to apply, depending on societies. Of course, hate speech, general hate speech prohibition to particularly gender hate speech expressions. And when it comes to disinformation, the only thing that I would like to say at this point is that we need to it's important to underscore the fact that the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression has always stressed that the best way to fight disinformation is not by imposing the legal obligation of saying the truth, but by other instruments, policy instruments, counter speech, more pluralism media sphere, good public service media, so that prohibitions are not established in this field, as I said. Thank you. In a nutshell, this is a very, very quick summary of many, many things that are treated. So, in any case, I'll invite you to take a look at it when it is available. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ruan. We're trying to fit in so many things here now. So I would like to hand over to Miti Karatul-Ai Tamina, please. But Miti, I have to ask you to keep it quite short, as you see, because we also need to let people in and have a discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Miti, we will need you to unmute your microphone, please.
Unmute.
I was saying that greetings from Bangladesh, and I better move on to sharing my screen so that I can finish it quickly. We are a bit short for time, aren't we? Okay. Does it come all right?
Go ahead and swap your settings, swap your screen.
Display, I see.
Yes, that's correct. Swap presenter.
Okay. Done. As you can see, this is Bangladesh and full of brimming with people. And here we talk about gender equality and media regulation. I am presenting the study and I have been the lead researcher, but as you can see, it's a teamwork. We worked in a big team. What we did, we mapped and analyzed through a gender equality lens, I said, gender equality, gender sensitivity, 43 acts and rules, including the Constitution. 21 of them, nearly half of them actually relates to media. Others have implications for media or provisions that impact media. Then we have 12 national media policies that we scanned. There are other laws and policies. We scanned and checked constitutions or similar documents of journalists associations and owners associations, self-regulatory codes, and we conducted a questionnaire survey of 18 media organizations to find out about policies in place. We interviewed representatives of self-regulatory bodies also. Now, I would like to give some contexts. When we talk about gender now, for us, it's female, male, and since 2014, we have an intersex and transgender community, Hijra. So gender equality for us now, legally, is recognized, has to be recognized for all three genders at least. Inequality, whereas when we talk about equality, inequality, for women even, inequality and lack of diversity in media, we still have a long way to go. I think Maria will probably talk about that later. Our constitution guarantees inequality, but there is a problem there. For women, equality is guaranteed in national and public spheres. Even positive discriminations are provided for disadvantaged citizens also. But what Constitution and other laws don't say anything about is inequality in personal laws, which dictate a woman's personal life, marriage, divorce, custody, and inheritance. And these are all linked. When somebody is working in a media, in a very traditional, classic patriarchal society, her role is defined within the family. Her first priority remains the family. And when she doesn't have rights in personal laws, then the status is compromised in a way. Anyways, and gender-based violence is rising, religiosity is rising. It's a 90%, over 90% Muslim country. When I say religiosity rising, I mean gender segregation and other practices in Islam. Safety and security are major concerns. Law, our law comes from, as many of us, from the British colonial period. Historically, media laws have been issued as a means of controlling the media. The first law requiring the newspapers to have government registration and staff licenses dates back to 1799. And that law, I mean, a version of that still exists. So Constitution guarantees freedom of expression and media freedom. The media sector is very sprawling, but it's not free actually. I mean, we rank pretty low in terms of media freedom or freedom of expression, let alone freedom of expression for gender minorities. There are problems with ownership of the industry also. And at all levels, politicization is a big, major problem. The owners represent big conglomerates into business, in politics. I think 6 of the MPs now own television stations. So, and if you keep track of, I mean, I'm sure you do, if you look at these characters and look for them, you know about them, they were all harassed by various restrictive laws. So when freedom of expression generally is curtailed, then claiming for another right becomes difficult, and fear, conflict of interest introduces self-censorship. COVID-19 worsened situations. I want to talk about the major trends that our research found on gender equality in and through media. Earlier provisions from the British period were more concerned about decency, obscenity, and other such issues from a more moralistic perspective, for protecting society, not for protecting gender rights. Post-Beijing Platform for Action trend has shifted the focus. That is when gender equality concerns actually entered media policies, started entering media policies. But the focus then shifted to media advocacy for women development and development. So actually gender equality is not really the dominant approach. Gender equality in media institutions or in equal coverage, these issues are not highlighted either by the policies or by the self-regulatory policies. The main focus is on provisions of gender sensitivity in content. Positive laws are there. For example, the no gender bar to ownership, but owners are very important if you want to really have gender equality integrated into media. Now, with owners, neither the laws are not really the platform for this, but policies could have discussed gender equality or sensitivity of owners as an eligibility criteria, which would have helped it a lot. Unfortunately, that's not there. Self-regulatory codes are rare. What is more rare is monitoring mechanism. So without monitoring and closely keeping track of what's happening, you cannot really achieve it. There are progresses, I must say. Workplace enabling provisions have improved, even if unevenly, but more needs to be done. Sexual harassment, when we talked with journalists, sexual harassment and abuse at workplaces are not properly registered or addressed, although they exist. We have a very good High Court's directive from 2009, which asks for, which makes it compulsory for all workplaces to have some provisions, but it's not largely being followed. Even if someone has done it, it's not being effective.
Meeti, I'm sorry if I'm
okay.
if I'm interrupting you. You have to wrap up.
Okay, I'm wrapping up.
Okay.
The last thing is, our finding was that we have to focus more on policies, and especially in-house policies, and build on whatever gains have been made. Now, the main problem seems in Bangladesh's context is the understanding is coming, it's here, but the main challenge is accepting these equalities. One senior pioneer woman journalist told me in her interview, you need change in the head. One way to do that could be ensuring equality. I mentioned equality in personal sphere because of that. If you have strong feet, then you can move strongly. If you are sort of, your status is not equal in other places, how can media be equal? So change in the head. And thank you very much. If I have taken too much.
No, thank you so much, Meeti. That was great. I know we're really running late here now, and there was supposed to be 20 minutes discussion in the end, and we have one presenter left. Would it be possible for people to stay on 5 or 10 minutes? Because we want to also get Maria Edström on stage and give us a Swedish example as a reference. I hope that people can stay on a little bit longer, so we get a chance also to discuss what has been presented. Please, Maria.
Thank you very much. And actually, I don't see anything. I can't select a PowerPoint, so maybe I could just go without that then and talk freely for a few minutes. Yes, I was supposed to present something about Sweden and why is Sweden part of this study. We just thought it would be like an interesting point of reference to the other countries that we don't know so much about, and also to see what does it actually look like in a welfare state as Sweden. And also that you could think of Sweden as, you know, the funders of Fojo and funders of other research projects that kind of supports the idea of freedom of expression and gender equality. Anyway, so what connotates Sweden is that we have very strong legislation regarding freedom of expression that goes back to 1766, and so that's like a strong legislation that is also kind of in the hearts of Swedish people, that you should have a vast freedom of expression. And there are actually almost no provisions on gender equality in these media legislations. But what we do have is a really strong legislation around gender equality. And so dating back to the 60s and the 70s, where we have, like, for example, individual taxations on households, which is, of course, makes a difference in the private sphere, as Meeti was talking about. And we also have shared parental leave since 1974, and we have a Sex Equality Act since the 80s. And the whole idea of the politics is to kind of mainstream gender equality into all areas. And that, I think, was inspired by the Beijing Platform for Action. We also have a Joint Discrimination Act and so on. And the whole idea is to make men and women able to have equal power to shape society, but also their own lives. So a lot of these legislation are regarding the private sphere. So then you might wonder, what is the most important thing for Sweden that performs fairly good, you would say, in the media, but not, we're still not gender equal in any sense. But so I would say it's good that we have this strong gender equality legislation as a foundation to have a representation and equal voice when we perform our right to express ourselves. And then I will have this idea that I would promote the new GEM data set. I was part of a research project, and some of you who are attending this seminar, we did a book called Comparing Gender Media Across the Globe, and I will put the links in the chat. And in that book, we talk about these things. What comes first? Is it gender equality in society or gender equality in the media, and how are these related? And what we see in that research project is that news media is lagging behind. They're much less gender equal than society as a whole. And then we have calculated a very easy to use gender index that anyone, even if you haven't taken part of these large global media monitoring projects and so on, you can still calculate it in your own country and be part of the conversation. So I will just encourage you to use the GEM index and to see that use monitoring to compare and understand where you are in society. And I was supposed to have the ending slide, but maybe Agneta, you have an ending slide you could end and just show that. And I will put the links into the chat. And I just congratulate for you and all participants to making this, because we need a lot more mapping and monitoring and understanding of what's going on and how we can help each other on this.
Thank you so much, Maria. I don't have an end slide. We were supposed to hand over to Albana, who will be going to moderate the discussion. So let's just do that for 5-10 minutes. Please, Albana.
Yeah. Good afternoon. You hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Yeah. Thank you for staying with us, to all the participants. I have put some suggestions in the chat about particular questions that were raised regarding collaboration, which I propose that Thomas, Claudia, and others would get in touch directly with each other to continue the discussion. As far as the questions that were also put in the chat, and maybe there are more, I see two questions that might deserve a few minutes. One is for Ruchi and one is from Aime. For Aime, there was a questions about the collaboration with foundations. Can you very briefly say, how do you want to pursue that?
It's not clear, the question for me. I mean, do you mean our link with foundations for this project? In this case, this project was supported by UNESCO and the International Program for the Development of Communication, which is a program with the UNESCO that supports this kind of initiatives. And but I mentioned also that in particular, and in the case of the situation that Ruchi has explained in Afghanistan, we as GAMAG linked with different actors, including, yes, foundations, but also with governments and with some big corporations, to seek support for Afghan women journalists. But I'm not sure that if this answered the question.
Okay. It's for us. It came from James Foley Foundation, and the idea was how, in terms of collaboration, what other partners, what other actors you're looking at. But okay, maybe we can continue with the other question, and then you get in touch together with the James Foley Foundation.
Yes, of course.
There is another question for Ruchi. Basically, how approachable are countries supporting Afghan government, such as Qatar, to support gender rights, including media women? How feasible is a regional strategy as compared to an international strategy that brings the baggage of allegations of Western culture influence, hence resisted on political grounds?
Right. I feel like the question is in two parts, focusing on the regional cooperation. Definitely the regional countries in South Asia and Central Asia and West Asia, we need to do more. Our governments need to do more, and they haven't done enough. They haven't, in some cases, like I'm from India, and I don't feel the Indian government did everything they could, or did anything for that matter, for journalists in particular, for women in particular. So our support is way more crucial and way more could potentially be way more impactful than the Western countries stepping in and protecting women, women's rights and women's freedoms. But when it comes to certain values, I feel these values are universal, so they are not exactly Western influence. When you talk about women wanting to be part of the media landscape, I don't think that's a Western value, or it could be perceived as a Western influence if, say, international governments were to pressure the Taliban de facto government to allow or to create an environment that allows women to return in large numbers back to the media landscape. I don't think that's a Western value. But yes, definitely regional, the weight or a larger share of proactive policies or work needs to come from regional governments, because culturally we do definitely share a lot of values. Plus, we are more familiar with the situation or the Afghan women go through, because we do share a lot of the challenges. Not everything. I won't claim that as an Indian journalist, as an Indian woman journalist, I would even know the challenges that Afghan women go through, but I could better comprehend some of their challenges, some of their than say the Western community, media community might.
Thank you, Ruchi. There are two comments in the same line. One is from Sonia Jill, and the other one is from Latifa Tayah. And basically it concerns the legal frameworks and the vulnerability. Latifa says, we do have quite good frameworks. It's about Morocco for gender equality. But in our national studies, we found that stereotypes are so interiorized, and we need to work a lot in their deconstruction. Sonia, do you want to say something about your comment that you just posted now?
Thank you so much for allowing me to quickly intervene and just say that while I understand the proposal about promoting regulation of gender equality in media spaces by using in-house policies more, this is very vulnerable because it's linked to who is in charge and who are the personnel at the time. And we know media institutions are very vulnerable to personnel attrition, management attrition. So unless it's linked to national regulatory structures and the monitoring impact that was mentioned is part of it, you're really not going to find sustainable advances through this approach. And I speak as a former broadcast regulator. Thank you.
Thank you. In order to round up, is there among the discussants and the researchers, you have been listening and reading each other's research, is there one final sentence that you would like to share with us before we close this session? Thank you all for the time and the patience and the interest. Yeah, Sarah, yeah, or Maria, yes, please.
I just came to think of Agnes Kalamar at Article 19, who already in 2006 wrote this article about gender-based censorship that was taking place within the newsroom, that we don't have to be afraid of censorship or regulation outside the newsrooms, because the journalists are doing it themselves. And I think the situation is better now, but it is a complex issue, and you have to kind of consider both what's happening inside the newsroom and outside. And in terms of policy versus regulation, you could think of regulation as the societal memory. Once you put in a legislation, that it has to be more firmer, you have to be well thought, whereas the policies can be changed for good or bad very quickly.
Thank you. Ruchi, maybe a few more words about where do you see we should work regarding addressing Afghanistan situation now?
Right. I actually also, yes, I wanted to add a point to the James Foley Foundation question as well, and to what you're saying. A lot of the Afghan women journalists are now out of jobs. There is a severe, aside from all the rights and freedoms that we're talking about, one of the major issues is that the shutting down of media houses has basically left a lot of the women journalists out of job. Many of them are struggling to make ends meet, and a lot of organizations have come forward and helped many of the journalists that I've witnessed. I'm sure there are many other organizations that are helping women journalists. Many of these women journalists are head of households in Afghanistan. So basically, these are families that are really suffering. So at a time when they are unable to make ends meet, it's really hard for them to talk about rights and freedoms and to be able to participate in meaningful civil protest, to fight for their rights. I think the most basic thing right now that we could do for women journalists is to help them survive, help them, provide emergency support. There are help them basically get back on their feet, and then we could empower them and talk further about how we could strengthen them in their advocacy to want to get back to work, to want to get back into the newsroom, and then the third step would be to talk about how much freedom can they have in the newsroom, how do they need to self-censor, do they need to can they speak about their stories, their their role in society, and etc. But I do feel like if an organization is interested, I feel like these are the 3 steps that they need to follow. First, help women survive. What very first is protect women. If there are women who want to leave, and many of them still want to leave because they're at risk, help them leave through international advocating with international governments to accept them as asylum seekers. Second is to help the ones who want to stay, help them survive, and then third is to help them get back into the newsrooms.
Thank you, Ruchi. If I may add one more sentence for Thomas, there is a whole discussion about the responsibility of the newsrooms when they involve freelancers, and the fact that the freelancers are not covered and are not recognized as staff. So in that sense, yesterday, the Ukrainian journalist that died, woman journalist, Alexandra Kuvshikova, I think there is more work to be done among several organizations in order to sensitize and to make the corporations responsible to recognize the work of the freelancers. Thank you. Who else? Yes, please. Sarah? And
okay. Yeah, thank you. So if there's one takeaway from our study, it is that there is no contradiction between gender equality in freedom of expression and media independence and freedom. Both are essential for democracy, and they are all protected by international norms and standards. And another thing that we are saying is that it is very important to recognize the importance of all these levels of legislation. They all work together at different levels, and therefore they're all important to advance this goal towards gender equality in and through the media. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are rounding up. Aima?
Yes, going back to Ruchi's point, at GAMAG, we are planning a follow-up on how to strengthen our support to those Afghan women journalists and helping to build a network of Afghan women journalists is at the core of our plans. So linked to the previous question, yes, of course, funds are needed for this. I mean, all the work that we do at GAMAG, I mean, linked to advocacy, is done by ourselves, and definitely, yes, if you are interested in joining us, we will be glad to come together, and so promptly we will let you know on how to do it. So I take the opportunity to thank you again for this wonderful session, and in particular to my colleagues Albana and Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.